Hi guys, hope everyone had a great long weekend. If you remember when we left off with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, we had just, the group had just seen the Oompa Loompas for the first time. So let's find out a little more about what they think of them. So chapter 16, Oompa Loompas. Oompa Loompas, everyone said at once. Oompa Loompas? Imported direct from Loompa Land, said Mr. Wonka proudly. There's no such place, said Mrs. Salt. Excuse me, dear lady, but Mr. Wonka, cried Mrs. Salt, I am a teacher of geography. Then you'll know all about it, said Mr. Wonka. And oh, what a terrible country it is. Nothing but thick jungles infested with the most dangerous beasts in the entire world. Hornswogglers and snozwangers and those terrible wicked wangdoodles. A wangdoodle would eat 10 Oompa Loompas for breakfast and come galloping back for a second helping. When I went out there, I found all the little Oompa Loompas living in tree houses. They had to live in tree houses to escape the wangdoodles and the hornswogglers and the snozwangers. They were practically starving to death. They were living on green caterpillars, and the caterpillars tasted revolting. And the Oompa Loompas spent every moment of their day climbing through the tree tops looking for other things to mash with the caterpillars to make them taste better. Red beetles, for instance, and eucalyptus leaves, and the bark of the bong tree, all of them beastly, but not quite as beastly as the caterpillars. Poor little Oompa Loompas. The one food they longed for more than any other was the cacao bean, and they couldn't get it. An Oompa Loompa was lucky if he found 3 or 4 cacao beans a year. But oh, how they craved them, and they used to dream of cacao beans all night and talk about them all day. You only had to mention the word cacao, and the Oompa Loompas would start dribbling at the mouth. The cacao bean, said Mr. Wonka continued, which grows on the cacao tree, happens to be the thing from which chocolate is made. You cannot make chocolate without the cacao bean. The cacao bean is chocolate. I myself use billions of cacao beans every week in this factory. And so, my dear children, as soon as I discovered the Oompa Loompas were crazy for this particular food, I climbed up into their treehouse village and poked my head in through the door of a treehouse belonging to the leader of the tribe. The poor little fellow looked thin and starved, and he was sitting there trying to eat a bowl of mashed up green caterpillars without being sick. Look here, I said, not speaking not English, of course, but in Oompa Loompa-ish. Look here. If you and all your people will come back to my country and live in the factory, you can have all the cacao beans you want. I have mountains of them in my storehouses. You can have cacao beans for every meal. You can gorge yourselves silly on them. I'll even pay your wages in cacao beans if you wish. You really mean it? Asked the Oompa Loompa leader, leaping up from his chair. Of course I mean it, I said. You can have chocolate as well. Chocolate tastes even better than cacao beans because it's got milk and sugar added. The little man gave a great whoop of joy and threw his bowl of mashed caterpillars right out the treehouse window. It's a deal, he said. Come on, let's go. So I shipped them all over there. Every man, woman, and child in the Oompa Loompa tribe. It was easy. I smuggled them over in large packing cases with holes in them, and they all got there safely. They're wonderful workers, and they all speak English now. They love dancing and music, and they're always making up songs. I expect you will hear a good deal of singing today from time to time. I must warn you, they are rather mischievous. They make jokes. They still wear the same kind of clothes they wore in the jungle. They insist upon that. The men, as you can see for yourselves across the river, wear only deer skins, and the women wear leaves, and the women and children wear leaves. And the women use fresh, cheap leaves every day. Daddy, shouted Veruca Salt, the girl who got everything she wanted. Daddy, I want an Oompa Loompa. I want you to get me an Oompa Loompa. I want an Oompa Loompa right away. I want to take it home with me. Go on, Daddy, get me an Oompa Loompa. Now, my pet, Father said, we mustn't interrupt Mr. Wonka. But I want an Oompa Loompa, screamed Veruca. All right, Veruca, all right. But I can't get it for you this second. Be patient. I'll see you have one before the day's out. Augustus, shouted Mrs. Gloop. Augustus, sweetheart, I don't think you better do that. Augustus Gloop, as you might have guessed, had quietly sneaked down to the edge of the river. He was now kneeling on the river bed, scooping hot, melted chocolate into his mouth as fast as he could. Chapter 17, Augustus Gloop Goes Up the Pipe. When Mr. Wonka turned round and saw that what Augustus Gloop was doing, he cried out, "Oh no, please, Augustus, please, I beg of you not to do that. My chocolate must be untouched by human hands." "Augustus," called out Mrs. Gloop, "didn't you hear what that man said? Come away from that river at once." "This stuff is terrific," said Augustus, taking not the slightest notice of what his mother or Mr. Wonka was saying. "Oh boy, I need a bucket to drink it properly." "Augustus," cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down and wagging his stick in the air, "you must come away. You are dirtying my chocolate." "Augustus," cried Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus," cried Mr. Gloop. Augustus was deaf to everything except the call of his enormous stomach. He was now lying full length on the ground with his head far out over the river, lapping up the chocolate like a dog. "Augustus," shouted Mrs. Gloop, You'll be giving that nasty cold of yours to about 1,000,000 people all over the country." "Be careful, Augustus," shouted Mr. Gloop. "You're leaning too far out." Mr. Gloop was absolutely right, for suddenly there was a shriek, then a splash, and into the river went Augustus Gloop, and in a second he disappeared under the brown surface. "Save him!" screamed Mrs. Gloop, going white in the face and waving her umbrella about. "He'll drown! He can't swim a yard! Save him! Save him!" "Good heavens, woman," said Mrs. Gloop. "I'm not diving in there. I've got my best suit on." Augustus Gloop's face came up again to the surface, painted brown with chocolate. "Help! Help! Help!" he yelled. "Fish me out!" "Don't just stand there!" Mrs. Gloop screamed at Mr. Gloop. "Do something!" "I am doing something," said Mr. Gloop, who was now taking off his jacket and getting ready to dive into the chocolate. But while he was doing this, the wretched boy was being sucked closer and closer towards the mouth of one of the great pipes that was dangling down into the river. Then all at once a powerful suction took hold of him completely, and he was pulled under the surface and then into the mouth of the pipe. The crowd on the riverbank waited breathlessly to see where he would come out. "There he goes," somebody shouted, pointing upwards. And sure enough, because the pipe was made of glass, Augustus Gloop could be clearly seen shooting up inside it, head first, like a torpedo. "Help! Police!" screamed Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus, come back at once! Where are you going?" "It's a wonder to me," said Mr. Gloop, "how that pipe is big enough for him to go through it." "It isn't big enough," said Charlie Bucket. "Oh dear, look! He's slowing down." "So he is," said Grandpa Joe. "He's gonna stick," said Charlie. "I think he is," said Grandpa Joe. "By golly, he's stuck," said Charlie. "It's his stomach that's done it," said Mr. Gloop. "He's blocked the whole pipe," said Grandpa Joe. "Smash the pipe," yelled Mrs. Gloop, still waving her umbrella. "Augustus, come out of there at once." The watchers below could see the chocolate swishing around the boy in the pipe, and they could see it building up behind him in a solid mass, pushing against the blockage. The pressure was terrific. Something had to give. Something did, and that something was Augustus. Woof! He shot up again like a bullet in the barrel of a gun. "He disappeared!" yelled Mrs. Gloop. "Where does that pipe go to? Quick, call the fire brigade!" "Keep calm," cried Mr. Wonka. "Keep calm, my dear lady, keep calm. There is no danger whatsoever. Augustus has gone on a little journey, that's all. A most interesting little journey, but he'll come out of it just fine. You wait and see." "How can he possibly come out just fine?" snapped Mrs. Gloop. He'll be made into marshmallows in 5 seconds." "Impossible!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Unthinkable, inconceivable, absurd. He could never be made into marshmallows." "And why not, may I ask?" shouted Mrs. Gloop. "Because the pipe doesn't go to the marshmallow room," Mr. Wonka answered. "It doesn't go anywhere near it. That pipe, the one that Augustus went up, happens to lead directly to the room where I make the most delicious kind of strawberry-flavored chocolate-coated fudge. Then he'll be made into strawberry-flavored chocolate-coated fudge," screamed Mrs. Gloop. "My poor Augustus, they'll be selling him by the pound all over the country tomorrow." "Quite right," said Mr. Gloop. "I know I'm right. It's beyond a joke. Mr. Wonka doesn't seem to think so, cried Mrs. Gloop. Just look at him. He's laughing his head off. How dare you laugh like that when my boy has just gone up the pipe? You monster, she shrieked, pointing her umbrella at Mr. Wonka as though she were going to run him through. You think it's a joke, don't you? You think that sucking my boy up into your fudge room like that is just one great big colossal joke. He'll be perfectly safe, said Mr. Wonka, giggling slightly. He'll be chocolate fudge, shrieked Mrs. Gloop. Never, cried Mr. Wonka. Of course he will, shrieked Mrs. Gloop. I wouldn't allow it. And why not? Shrieked Mrs. Gloop. Because that would taste terrible, said Mr. Wonka. Just imagine it. Augustus-flavored chocolate-coated gloop? No one would buy it. They most certainly would, cried Mrs. Gloop indignantly. I don't want to think about it, shrieked Mrs. Gloop. Nor do I, said Mr. Wonka. And I do promise you, madam, that your darling boy is perfectly safe. If he's perfectly safe, then where is he? Snapped Mrs. Gloop. Lead me to him this instant. Mr. Wonka turned around and clicked his fingers sharply. Click, 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 3 times. And immediately an Oompa Loompa appeared, as if from nowhere, and stood beside him. The Oompa Loompa bowed and smiled, showing beautifully white teeth. His skin was rosy white, his long hair was golden brown, and the top of his head came just above the height of Mr. Wonka's knee. He wore the unusual deerskin slung over his shoulder. Now listen to me, said Mr. Wonka, looking down at the tiny man. I want you to take Mr. and Mrs. Gloop up to the fudge room and help them find their son, Augustus. He's just gone up the pipe. The Oompa Loompa took one look at Mrs. Gloop and exploded into peals of laughter. Oh, do be quiet, said Mr. Wonka. Control yourself. Pull yourself together. Mrs. Gloop doesn't think this is at all funny. You can say that again, Mrs. Gloop said. Go straight to the fudge room, Mr. Wonka said to the Oompa Loompa, and when you get there, take a long stick and start poking around the inside of the big chocolate mixing barrel. I'm almost certain you'll find him in there. You'd better look sharp. You'll have to hurry. If you leave him in the mixing barrel too long, he's liable to get poured in the fudge boiler, and that would really be a disaster, wouldn't it? My fudge would become quite inedible. Mrs. Gloop let out a shriek of fury. I'm joking, said Mr. Wonka, giggling madly behind his beard. I didn't mean it. Forgive me. I'm so sorry. Goodbye, Mrs. Gloop and Mr. Gloop. Goodbye. Goodbye. I'll see you later. As Mr. and Mrs. Gloop and their tiny escort hurried away, the 5 Oompa Loompas on the far side of the river suddenly began hopping and dancing about, beating wildly on a number of very small drums. Augustus Gloop, they chanted. Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop. Grandpa, cried Charlie. Listen to them, Grandpa. What are they doing? Shh, whispered Grandpa Joe. I think they're going to sing us a song. Augustus Gloop, chanted the Oompa Loompas. Augustus Gloop, Augustus Gloop, the great big greedy nincompoop. How long could we allow this beast to gorge and guzzle, feed and feast on everything he wanted to? Great Scott, it simply wouldn't do. However long this pig might live, we're positive he'd never give even the smallest bit of fun or happiness to anyone. So what do we do in cases such as this? We use the gentle touch, and carefully we take the brat and turn him into something that will give great pleasure to us all. A doll, for instance, or a ball, or marbles, or a rocking horse. But this revolting boy, of course, was so unutterably vile, so greedy, so foul, so infantile. He left a most disgusting taste inside our mouths, and so in haste we chose the thing we chose a thing that what may take this nasty taste away. Come on, we cried, the time is ripe to send him shooting up the pipe. He has to go, it has to be, and very soon he's going to see, inside the room in which he's gone, some funny things are going on. But don't, dear children, be alarmed. Augustus Gloop will not be harmed, although of course we must admit he will be altered quite a bit. He'll be quite changed from what he's been when he goes through the fudge machine. Slowly the wheels go round and round. The cogs begin to grind and pound. 100 knives to slice, slice, slice. We'll add some sugar, cream, and spice. We boil him for a minute more until we're absolutely sure that all the greed and all the gall is boiled away once and for all. Then out he comes, and now, by grace, a miracle has taken place. The boy who only just before was loathed by men from shore to shore, this greedy brute, this louse's ear, is loved by people everywhere. For who could hate or bear a grudge against a luscious bit of fudge? I told you they love singing, cried Mr. Wonka. Aren't they delightful? Aren't they charming? But you mustn't believe a word they say. It's all nonsense, every bit of it. Are the Oompa Loompas really joking, Grandpa? Asked Charlie. Of course they're joking, answered Grandpa Joe. They must be joking. At least, I hope they're joking. Don't you? So, Chapter 18, Down the Chocolate River. Off we grow, cried Mr. Wonka. Hurry up, everybody. Follow me to the next room. And please don't worry about Augustus Gloop. He's bound to come out in the wash. They always do. We shall have to make the next part of the journey by boat. Here she comes. Look. A steamy mist was rising up now from the great warm chocolate river, and out of the mist there appeared suddenly a most fantastic pink boat. It was a large open rowboat with a tall front and a tall back, like a Viking boat of old. And it was of such shining, sparkling, glistening pink, such a shining, sparkling, glistening pink color that the whole thing looked as if it were made of glass. And there were many oars on either side of it, and as the boat came closer, the watches on the riverbank could see the oars being pulled by masses of Oompa Loompas, at least 10 of them on each oar. This is my private yacht, cried Mr. Wonka, beaming with pleasure. I made her by hollowing out an enormous boiled sweet. Isn't she beautiful? How she comes cutting through the river. The gleaming pink boiled sweet boat glided up to the riverbank. 100 Oompa Loompas rested on their oars and stared up at the visitors. Then suddenly, for some reason, best known only to themselves, they all burst into shrieks of laughter. What's so funny? Asked Violet Beauregard. Oh, don't worry about them, cried Mr. Wonka. They're always laughing. They think everything's a colossal joke. Jump onto the boat, all of you. Come on, hurry up. As soon as everyone was safely in, the Oompa Loompas pushed the boat away from the bank and began to row swiftly down the river. Hey there, Mike Teavee. Mike Teavee, shouted Mr. Wonka. Please do not lick the boat with your tongue. It'll only make it sticky. And there they all are on their boat. Daddy, said Veruca Salt, I want a boat like this. I want you to buy me a big pink boiled sweet boat exactly like Mr. Wonka's. And I want a lot of Oompa Loompas to row me about. And I want a chocolate river. And I want. She wants a good kick in the pants, whispered Grandpa Joe to Charlie. The old man was sitting in the back of the boat, and little Charlie Bucket was right beside him. Charlie was holding tightly onto his grandfather's bony old hand. He was in a whirl of excitement. Everything that he had seen so far, the great chocolate river, the waterfall, the huge sucking pipes, the candy meadows, the Oompa Loompas, the beautiful pink boat, and most of all, Mr. Willy Wonka himself, had all been so astonishing that he began to wonder whether there could possibly be any more astonishments left. Where were they going now? What were they going to see? And what in the world was going to happen in the next room? Isn't it marvelous? Said Grandpa Joe, grinning at Charlie. Charlie nodded and smiled up at the old man. Suddenly, Mr. Wonka, who was sitting on Charlie's other side, reached down into the bottom of the boat and picked up a large mug and dipped it into the river, filled it with chocolate, and handed it to Charlie. Drink this, he said. It'll do you good. You look starved to death. Then Mr. Wonka filled a second mug and gave it to Grandpa Joe. You too, he said. You look like a skeleton. What's the matter? Hasn't there been anything to eat in the house lately? Not much, said Grandpa Joe. Charlie put his mug to his lips, and as the rich, warm, creamy chocolate ran down his throat into his empty tummy, his whole body from head to toe began to tingle with pleasure, and a feeling of intense happiness spread over him. You like it? Asked Mr. Wonka. Oh, it's wonderful, said Charlie. "The creamiest, loveliest chocolate I've ever tasted," said Grandpa Joe, smacking his lips. "That's because it's been mixed by waterfall," Mr. Wonka told him. The boat sped on down the river. The river was getting narrower. There was some kind of dark tunnel up ahead, a great round tunnel that looked like an enormous pipe, and the river was running right into the tunnel, and so was the boat. "Row on!" shouted Mr. Wonka, jumping up, the wave waving his stick in the air. "Full speed ahead!" And with the Oompa Loompas rowing faster than ever, the boat shot into the pitch-dark tunnel, and all the passengers screamed with excitement. "How can they see where they're going?" shrieked Violet Beauregard in the darkness. "There's no knowing where they're going," cried Mr. Wonka, hooting with laughter. "There's no earthly way of knowing in which direction they are going. There's no way of knowing where they're rowing, or which way the river is flowing. Not a speck of light is showing, so the danger must be growing, for the rowers keep on rowing, and they're certainly not showing any signs that they're slowing." "He's gone off his rocker," shouted one of the fathers, aghast, and the other parents joined in the chorus of frightened shouting. "He's crazy," they shouted. "He's balmy, he's nutty, he's screwy, he's batty, he's tippy, he's dotty, he's daffy, he's goofy, he's beany, he's buggy, he's wacky, he's loony." "No, he is not," said Grandpa Joe. "Switch on the lights," shouted Mr. Wonka, and suddenly on came the lights, and the whole tunnel was brilliantly lit up, and Charlie could see that they were indeed inside a gigantic pipe, and that the great walls, the great upward curving walls of the pipe were pure white and spotlessly clean. The river of chocolate was flowing incredibly fast inside the pipe. The Oompa Loompas were rowing like crazy, and the boat was rocketing along at a furious pace. Mr. Wonka was jumping up and down in the back of the boat and calling to the rowers to row faster and faster still. He seemed to love the sensation of whizzing through a tunnel with a pink boat on a chocolate river, and he was clapping his hands and laughing and kept glancing at his passengers to see if they were enjoying it as much as he. "Look, Grandpa," said Charlie. "There's a door in the wall." It was a green door, and it was set into the wall of the tunnel just above the level of the river. As they flashed past it, there was just enough time to read the writing on the door. "Storeroom number 54, it said. "All of the creams. Dairy cream, whipped cream, violet cream, coffee cream, pineapple cream, vanilla cream, and hair cream." "Hair cream?" cried Mike Teavee. "You don't use hair cream." "Row on!" shouted Mr. Wonka. "There's no time to answer silly questions." They streaked past a black door. "Storeroom number 71, it said on it. "Whips, all shapes and sizes." "Whips!" cried Veruca Salt. "What on earth do you use whips for?" "For whipping cream, of course," shouted Mr. Wonka. "And how can you whip cream without whips? Whipped cream isn't whipped cream at all unless it's been whipped with whips, just as a poached egg isn't a poached egg unless it's been stolen from the woods in the dead of night. Row on, please." They passed a yellow door on which it said "Storeroom number 77, all the beans, cacao beans, coffee beans, jelly beans, and has-beans." "Has-beans?" cried Violet Beauregard. "You're one of them yourself," said Mr. Wonka. "There's no time for arguing. Press on, press on." But 5 seconds later, when a bright red door came into sight ahead, he suddenly waved his gold-topped cane in the air and shouted, "Stop the boat!" Okay, I think tomorrow we will pick up there and find out what is behind the bright red door. Okay, bye guys. See you tomorrow.